Good morning. The scripture this morning is from Luke 5:36 through 39. And Jesus continues teaching and telling us, revealing who he is. He told them this parable: no one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise, they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new one will not match the old. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants new, for they say the old is better. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
As I planned for this worship series, I thought about old things and new things, things that have endings and then the beginnings that follow. And one of the scripture passages that felt so obvious to include was this one. I mean, it literally talks about old things and new things, an old garment and a new one, old wine and wineskins and the new. I figured it would be perfect, and so I slated it for this week. And then several weeks after I scheduled it, I started to study it. And I went, it's not quite as easy or as forthright as I initially thought. I'm going to have to work a little bit harder. And so I started going to some of the commentaries that I use. And do you know what? People don't talk about these 3 verses. They just sort of go, we'll just sort of slow them aside there. They don't do much. So that meant there wasn't a whole lot to build on. So I had to go digging a little bit, which is okay with me. I'm happy to do that. And what I find sort of most effective is to dig into the illustration, the analogy that Jesus has offered, and then to see what we find there. So that's our process for today. Verse 36 says, no one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise, they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. This is pretty straightforward, right? Just like Bethany illustrated for us with the kids, to match those things, or to take the new good sock and cut it up, create a hole in it to repair the old, it doesn't quite make sense. We're going to build on the apparel that we're looking at this morning. Imagine a blazer or a good pair of trousers, but not just in today, right? Today we're in the era of fast fashion. If something comes apart, if it rips, if it tears, what do? We just throw it out and go buy a new one. It's easier, it's cheaper, it's more reasonable to do that. So in some ways it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this, but I think most of us can go back a few decades. At least in our minds, some of us very easily, to the time when we made an investment in an article of clothing, a significant investment, often a wool item, right, that was good for work and for our Sunday best. And those items were preserved in a particular way to maintain their integrity. I don't know about you, but me in today's fashion, with my life as a mom and somebody who likes to exercise and move my body and somebody who takes calls for the hospital all the time, here and there, I have to sort of be flexible in my attire. I want to be able to wear what I'm wearing wherever I need to go, and then at the end of the day, throw it in the washing machine and not have to run to the dry cleaners to wear that item again. But again, we're not talking about today. We're going back in that time when we had to maintain the integrity of the item. So after Sunday worship, when you wore your Sunday best, you put those things back in the closet on their hanger, and then you got into your grubbies. Anybody from the era of grubbies? Most of us, right? Where we lived in those multiple assortments. We wore good clothes, good shoes to certain places, and then we could do whatever we wanted in the other stuff that was ripped and torn apart or a little bit raggedy. Okay, so we're in that era where the item is special. And if you treat it as such, it lasts and lasts and lasts. My grandmother was kind of a clothes horse and very fashionable. So I have a number of her items of clothing that I can still wear today. Items from the 50s and the 60s that are still solid and in good shape and good quality, and I can use them still because she maintained the importance of those items, right? She cared for them appropriately, and inheriting them as they are, I do my best to do the same. Okay. So imagine you have one of those items, blazer or trousers, and it's starting to wear thin. The elbows are running out, or the inside seams and the pant legs are sort of getting thin. Maybe they don't fit quite right, and a little raggedy around the cuffs. What do? You keep wearing it, probably, because we love it, right? It's an item and it's wearing out because it's been well loved, it's been well used, we made a significant investment, and at some point in its life, we probably have to go and get a new one, right? Maybe a little bit reluctantly because we love this one and it's so comfortable and it's got that wear where it's just so soft and so lovely, but really, somebody's going to have a fit if we keep wearing it as it is. And so we go and buy a new one. Or maybe if we're lucky, we're good and we can tailor our own. Or we've got an in-law or somebody who could do it. I got Aunt Betty in my example. For me, it'd probably be Aunt Chris or Aunt Nancy. They were good seamstresses. Aunt Patty, I have to tell you all of them, otherwise I'm going to get in trouble. All right, so I could ask any of my aunts to make me a good pair of pants. Right? And so she makes that investment, makes them to fit for me, and they're good quality, and they're made well, and they've got good fabric. And I go, but man, I really love those old ones. So I'm going to take the new ones, and I'm going to cut them so that I can mend the old ones. Now, you haven't met my aunts, but I can tell you it will not be a pretty picture if that's what I do. They're fierce. We all fear them for good cause because they have no problem telling us what we need to know in any given moment. Okay, so I'm not going to cut up the new pants. I probably am going to fold up those old pants because I'm really not ready to let them go. And it may be that at some point, I need to use some of them to mend or fix something else. And because they're already worn or torn or stretched, I can do that, right? I don't use the best part of it, but I'm going to use a part of it. All right, friends, my iPad is giving up the ghost right now, so we're going to go for it, all right? If you don't like it, blame technology. Okay. So we're going to do that so it doesn't distract me. All right, so we've got these pants, and we're going to maintain the integrity of them. We're not going to cut up the new garment to fix the old, because you just don't do that. Do you know what Jesus is saying? That. Just as simply and plainly, it makes all the sense in the world that you don't take the brand new thing that you've just made this new investment in and cut it up to fix the old thing. You don't do that. It doesn't make any sense. That's all Jesus is saying. It's pretty plain, straightforward wisdom. So we're going to shelf that one. We're going to set it aside. We're going to look at this other analogy, and then we're going to figure out what to do with both of them. Okay, so in the other analogy, we have old wine and old wineskins, and we have new wine and new wineskins. And in the first century, everybody would have understood the dynamic that's being explained here. How many of you have made wine? Okay, like less than a dozen. How many of you made your wine in a wine skin? Exactly, okay? Nobody did, because we don't do that in the modern world. In the modern time, maybe not for your home brew, but in a regular winery, what do they put the wine in to ferment? In a barrel. That's the standard kind of thing, unless you go to Italy and then it's this whole other thing. But they put them in a barrel, and then the wine ferments, okay? So there's a process that happens there that we don't fully understand with the concept of a barrel because it doesn't morph the material in the same way. So I'm going to give us a different example, and then we're going to come back to the wine and the wineskins. Many of you know I like to cook. If you follow me on social media, half my pictures are food because I really like to cook. And I like to cook because that's how I grew up, and I like to eat. I like to eat food that I enjoy, so I try and cook well so that I can eat well. And I like to eat across a whole variety of foods and food types, and I'm not really afraid to try new things. So if you want to, if I want to try a new recipe, I'll go for that. And I found that there are a number of foods that are really not that hard. They just take time. So one of those foods that isn't all that hard, but it just takes time is kimchi. And when I was home in 2020, like a lot of us were, had a little extra time on my hands, and so I decided I'm going to try and make kimchi. And I texted a friend of mine who's Korean, and I said, hey, do you have a recipe, some guidance? And he sends me a recipe, and he sends me a YouTube link. This is not hard, right? So I go to the store, I get all the ingredients I need, and you take the cabbage leaves, you pull them apart, you salt them, and then you let them sit in a bowl till they sweat, and then you rinse them off in cold water. And then you make this paste. You chop all your vegetables, you make this paste, and then you spread the paste on all the leaves, you roll them up, you put them in a jar, stack them in, and then it sits on the counter for like a week, and you're supposed to take the cap off every day and just sort of let the gas release, and then you put your kimchi in the fridge. You can eat it whenever you want. Not very hard. A little bit of process, but not very hard. So I did this in 2020. You can see the picture. These are my jars full of kimchi. Followed all the instructions, did all the things. I go to bed, and the next morning, these are my jars of kimchi, which if you can't see that picture well, that's kimchi juice all over my counter and down to the floor, because as the fermentation process takes place, it expands and it has to go somewhere, and so it sort of seeped out of each of those jars and made this lovely mess for me, which I got to clean up. And then you're supposed to take the lid off the jar so you can release the gas. I figured enough had been released, but this instead is what I got. Which, if you can't see that well, the kimchi is sort of erupting out of the jar. It had all fit perfectly the day before, and I figured that as it processed, the cabbage leaves would soften, and you could just push them down, that it would actually take less space, not more, but I was wrong. I learned some things while I made kimchi, and so I had to go to a new jar and put these things over there. So what we see in this illustration is how fermentation expands the item that we're working with, the food or the liquid that we're working with. So now, if we go back to the wine and the wineskins, some of you are connoisseurs. I am not. I'm a simpleton. I know this about making wine. You pick some grapes, you smash them, you strain the skins, and then you put the grape juice in a container and you let it ferment, and then you have wine. If you do it wrong, you have vinegar, whatever. So we get to the point where we have the grape juice, you pour it in the wineskin. We're going to see a picture here. It's like a leather canteen. That's what we're talking about, is a leather canteen. So you pour your grape juice into the leather canteen. This one's flat. And as it ferments, it bloats. It gets big. So you can see these are fulfilling their fermentation process. Now, a new wineskin is young, new leather. Why? Because it's pliable, it'll stretch. So when that fermentation process happens, it stretches it, and the wineskin can absorb the fermentation process. Well, after a wineskin has gone through the fermentation process, it's kind of hit its limit. So if you were to put grape juice in again in the old wineskin, and that expansion process happens, what happens? You have this kimchi problem, right? You get juice all over, it busts open, you've ruined your old wineskin, you've lost your potential wine, and the whole thing is a mess. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying if you're making new wine, if you have grape juice, you have to put it in a new wineskin because the new wineskin is flexible. Everybody knows that. This is obvious in the first century. And then he gives you this conclusion, which again is obvious. He says, and anybody who's had old wine doesn't want new wine. Which I don't know that many of us have gone through the process, maybe those of you who have made wine, but if you taste the grape juice when it's grape juice, that's one thing, right? And then it's another thing if you wait for it to go through its whole process. But if you sort of taste test along the way, it's kind of mixed results. Kind of like with the kimchi, it's edible the next day and the next, but you really have to give it that week or two or even a month to really percolate, and you get all that flavor and you get all those probiotics, which have their other benefits for you. So there's this process that's entailed. Jesus is just saying that, well, duh, nobody drinks the new wine because it's not done with the process. All of the people who are drinking wine want the old wine. They want the fermented wine, the matured wine, the actual wine that you could, pass around the table. Okay, so these are our parables. They're really fairly straightforward for us. So then the question becomes, so what? What do we do with that? Okay, so Jesus shares some contemporary modern wisdom, like, good job, Jesus. Why was this relevant? Well, some folks will tell you the relevance is Jesus is saying the new things are good and the old things can't contain them, and the old things are only going to break if you try and put in new things, so you have to disregard the old things. I would tell you those people are wrong. I don't think that's what we get from either analogy. It's not that new is better than old. It's not that one is to be preserved and the other is to be disregarded. It's that they both serve a purpose in a certain function and a certain time and a certain way, and they have to be honored within that time and in that purpose. So the fact that I wore my trousers to death and I have to go buy a new pair of trousers does not mean my first pair of trousers were not valuable, right? I'm not erasing their worth simply because I have to get a new pair. It's just, I'm in a new era, and I shouldn't be like fixing these with the new thing. I can hold on to these because maybe the new ones are gonna rip. Maybe they're going to have a problem, and so then I'm going to need some kind of fabric to be able to make the patch or make the mend. But it's not one or the other. It's that they each serve a purpose in a particular way, and there's a certain order to how we go about things. And I think it's a little bit different with the wine, but they both still serve a purpose. But what I find in the wine analogy is if we have old wine, and we like drinking wine, right? Or we don't need to be sober for particular reasons for our mental health, physical health, any of those things. So we have old wine, and we consume our old wine, and we consume more old wine, and we do nothing with new wine. What do we end up with? No wine. If all we're doing is consuming that which has fermented, that which has processed, that which has already transformed, if all we do is consume it and we do no creating, then I'm going to run out of wine. And if when I run out of that old wine, I take my old wine skin, I don't have a new one, I take my old wine skin and I dare to put some new wine in it, then I'm going to lose the new wine and the wine skin. And then I have nothing, right? But if I enjoy consuming wine, if it's a part of my life or my livelihood, then I have to create new wine regularly, consistently, because it takes time, it takes process. So I have to start the process, have the new wineskin, have the fresh juice, and let that be sort of going through its process while I'm over here consuming. And I can't forget to start another batch because there's a progression of things. They have to keep moving and keep going. Do you hear how it's not a negation of one or the other, but understanding the dynamism that exists between them? Okay, so it's not really all about alcohol this morning. It's really about how we do life and the ways that we make space or refuse to make space for new things and old things. And I could push on some particulars for us within ourselves or within the life of the church or within the life of our community, our country, our world, any of those things. There are old things and there are new things. And there are old things that are beloved and sacred and important, and they have served their time and their purpose. And it's time to shelf them and bring in some new things. And to shelf these does not deny their value, their worth, or the purpose that they have served. It is to say, you have fulfilled it, and I need this new thing so that I can go into a new era. That's one way for us to be mindful about this passage. The other is, there are some things that we want and need in perpetuity. We like the good stuff. We like the stuff that's aged. I like cheese, I like wine, I like bread, I like kimchi, I like all those things, and they all take time. And I can't just consume them without any regard for what I'm producing. If I want more down the road, I have to be willing to produce something now. I have to realize that I'm both investing in that which has been and in that which will be. So again, we could push on particulars, but what I felt like the Spirit was telling me was leave it to ferment in your own hearts and your own minds. That if I put too much definition on what we're talking about, you may be like, oh, well, Pastor Debbie was only talking about this, so these things, they don't apply. I'm going to keep trying to put my new thing into the old thing, regardless of how it's not working. Or I'm going to keep being willing to cut up the new thing so that they'll hold on to that beloved thing. I don't want you to do that. I want you to hear whatever the Spirit is trying to tell you about your own life and your own assumptions and beliefs about our shared life, and see what grows and manifests. And know this, that when we're doing new things, when we're making space for new things, there's a requirement. It's got to be dynamic. We've got to be flexible. There's got to be head space, like the jar, or head space for those things to grow, to become, so that we might accommodate them appropriately. So whatever ways the Spirit is moving, whatever we need to see between the old and the new, that which is being replaced and that which is working in perpetuity, I pray that we have eyes to see and ears to hear. Amen.